Good morning, boys and girls. Good to see you again. We are here to learn about another exciting doctor of the church. I wanted to share with you this doctor's bestseller. The doctor is Athanasius, and he wrote a bestseller back in the 4th century. So I was hoping to get you excited about that. Saint Athanasius is our doctor of the church that I'm going to talk about with you. And I'm going to give you a famous quote about St. Athanasius to get us set for this dramatic story. When we talk about Athanasius, we always say Athanasius against the world. And the reason we say that is because he fought against the heresy of Arius for so long that he had this amazing reputation of Athanasius against the world. So he's really just a hero of ours, a hero of the faith, and I wanted to share his exciting life with you. Let's see. Let me go ahead, and I'm just going to write his name for you. I'm going to use the whiteboard this time. I'm having some trouble with my document camera, so if we've all learned anything in this time, it's we have to be flexible, right? Here is how his name looks. Saint Athanasius. He was from the Diocese of Alexandria, Egypt. He was born in 296 and he died in 373. And he was the chief opponent of Arius. I know somehow all of our lessons always seem to go back to the heresy of Arianism. So let me give you some brief notes about Arius to remind you. Arius, as is often the case with a lot of these heretics, he was a priest. He was a priest in the Diocese of Alexandria in Egypt. And I'm going to give you the slogan of the Arians, okay? This is false, but we cannot refute error if we don't know their own slogans. And they, in talking about Jesus Christ, would say, there was a time when he was not. Notice, I did not capitalize. Look over here. I did not capitalize he. In fact, let's see if I could embolden that to make my, no, it didn't work. Anyway, I didn't capitalize it because they did not believe Jesus was fully divine. They did not believe he was co-eternal with the Father. They did not believe he was co-equal with the Father. Okay, so this is the legacy of Arius, okay, and Arianism. All right, let's go back to our hero, Saint Athanasius. Now, Saint Athanasius was a young man when he rose in church life. In fact, people sometimes marvel at how young he was when he did what he did. We know that he was a deacon and he lived in the household of the bishop at the time. The bishop at the time was Alexander of Alexandria. You want to try and say that 3 times? Alexander of Alexandria, who was actually a very brilliant bishop, and he was pretty mild-tempered. But he kind of lost it when Arius called Alexander a heretic. And at that point, the bishop had had enough. He disciplined Arius. He suspended him from orders, priestly orders. Now, while all this is going on, I bet my upper school kids know this. There is a famous emperor who had legalized Christianity. He had had his own conversion. Who would that be? We're talking about the Emperor Constantine. Let me get back to my board. Constantine, the Emperor Constantine. He, of course, was a pagan. He had a vision of the cross when he was in a battle. He heard, by this sign you will conquer. And then he had a conversion. Of course, his mother was St. Helena, who discovered the true cross. Constantine was very concerned about the lack of unity in his empire. He actually, there's a lot of misinformation about Constantine. He actually didn't really have an opinion about Arius. He just said, you bishops need to get together and figure out what we're going to do about this crisis so we can all be united. So he called the Council of Nicaea. When did he do that? I'm hoping you guys know when the Council of Nicaea was. Can I listen? 325 AD. He called the Council of Nicaea the first ecumenical council. By this time, Athanasius had already been advising Alexander. He was rising up. So once the Council of Nicaea is called and the bishops are discussing things, it's going to be Athanasius who is a leading voice in this council. And scholars say he was probably 25 years old, which is shocking, for someone so young to do that, in history. Now, in 328, by the way, just you guys know the Council of Nicaea, we get the skeleton for the Nicene Creed, and they save the faith. Let's jump to 3 years later. It's 328. Alexander the bishop, a holy man, is dying on his deathbed. He says, I want Athanasius to be my successor. Now, the rule was at the time, you had to be 30 to be a bishop. He was not quite 30. They made him bishop anyway. His age is going to be an issue that will come to haunt him. He becomes the bishop, and he actually is a man of great discipline. He learns how to practice penance that the monks practiced. He disciplined himself, and then he traveled all around the empire to strengthen people in their fight against Arius. Because the issue of Arianism became so political, you don't just have bishops, you have political figures involved. He makes a lot of enemies, and that's why I told you at the beginning, Athanasius against the world. He ends up being exiled 5 times. Now, I want you to get your calculators out. Athanasius was bishop for 40 years. So think about that, 40 years. He was exiled 5 times, and scholars who have added up all the months that he was gone have concluded that he was in exile for 17 years. Can you believe that? So that's a lot. He was in exile for 17 years. However, he took advantage of his exile to win friends and allies for the truth, for the church. So we know he went as far as Germany, France, and Rome. He went and visited the Pope. He made friends with the Pope. He often lived with monks. One scholar says that Athanasius used this time of struggle as, quote, an upward fall. Get it? Fall, but upward. In other words, he made the best out of it. And they say, people who knew Athanasius said he was never one to pity himself. He never felt sorry for himself. And he was very confident and cheerful. He took a big view of history, the long view, and he said, God's in charge. He is going to win. I have no doubt. So he never felt sorry for himself. They also say he had an incredible sense of humor. Now, I want to tell you about this best-selling book that he wrote, because it concerns another saint. This bestseller that he wrote is about Saint Anthony of the Desert. We also call him Saint Anthony of Egypt. Saint Anthony of Egypt lived from 251 to 356. He is famous for being, he's not a doctor of the church, he's actually called a desert father. He teaches us about desert spirituality. And there's a great story about Anthony of Egypt that I want to share. Again, we know a lot of his life thanks to Saint Athanasius. There is a story that when Saint Anthony was a little boy, he got all his friends together and they played the game baptism by the water. They played the game baptism. And apparently he was so otherworldly and holy when he played this game that the bishop at the time, Alexander, came up to him and said, what are you doing? And he spoke with Anthony for a while. And the story says that the bishop actually went to Anthony's parents' home, knocked on the door and said, I'm watching your son. and he is a special kid. And by the way, those baptisms are valid. Can you believe that? He said, even though they're playing a game, it's a real baptism. And so this is going to be the rise of St. Anthony. Now, there's a famous story about St. Anthony of Egypt, and it's in Athanasius's book, and it changes the history of the church. So here's the story. Anthony of Egypt was wondering how to serve the Lord, what to do with his life, and he heard a scripture one day that changed his life. I'm going to read it to you. It's from Matthew 19. And the scripture is, if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. When he heard this scripture, he received this amazing strength, and he, lived this new life of being a monk. They say that young men in the West and in the East read this book out loud to each other, read this story out loud to each other. This was the rage of the whole empire, okay? And so because of that, thereafter, saints always said, I want to be like St. Anthony. I want to get my scripture and know what I'm supposed to do with my life. In fact, if you remember, I talked to you about St. Augustine a week or two ago. He wanted his scripture too. He kept telling the Lord, where's my Matthew 19? And I think I told you, he finally got it from Romans about living a life relying on God's grace. So I think we need to be like St. Athanasius and publicize this story of St. Anthony of Egypt and take it in and remember that there is a scripture written in heaven for each one of us. Now that you have the time for more silence, ask the Lord, what is my scripture? What am I supposed to do with my life? Ask him to ring it in your ears, just like he did for St. Anthony of Egypt, and write it down and share it. And then that is how the good news is spread. That's how the Lord's always done it in the church, okay? So we are going to ask St. Athanasius for that intention. St. Athanasius against the world, ora pro nobis, okay? And I will see you next time for our next Doctor of the Church. Take care.